Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 39 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Calgary Flames and lost by a score of 3-1. And with this, the Sharks' losing streak now gets extended to 7 games as they are coming dangerously close to matching the total that they had at the beginning of the year when they rattled off 9 straight losses to open up the season. Of course, there are some excuses that you can give. This stretch of 7 games has not been easy in terms of quality of competition. They've faced off against teams like Winnipeg, Edmonton, Colorado, Vegas. This is the cream of the crop teams in the NHL, and they have been in winning positions in many of these games, but at the end of the day, they've lost each and every one of them. And while you're not expecting amazing hockey or even 500 hockey from the Sharks, you are hoping that they would be able to pick up a victory here or there, 1 or 2 wins to help try and keep up team morale and team confidence, because as we are getting now to the halfway mark of the season, the time for moral victories has kind of come and gone, and you actually want to be able to get a couple of points occasionally. And with this loss, the Sharks now find themselves dead last in the entire league, having just barely passed Chicago for 32nd place in terms of points percentage, thanks to the 3 extra games played that they have thus far this season. With that being said, the Sharks have had major problems this year, that's no secret, offensively and defensively, and here tonight was definitely no different against the Calgary Flames. Their major problem that I really noticed was actually their breakouts. Now, this is not anything new. The Sharks struggled to clear out of their zone in pretty much every single one of the games that they have played thus far this season, but a lot of the times that does occur when they're having to take these extended shifts in the defensive zone. When they get caught out for 60 seconds, 90 seconds on the ice, they get to a point where their defensemen are just wildly swinging at pucks, hoping that they get over the blue line so that they can head to the bench to get a change. Here tonight, it was not only that was a problem, but even when they had fresh legs and they had the opportunity to draw up a play, to draw up a breakout, they were failing to do so at all. Sure, you could blame the fact that the Sharks don't really have much puck-moving ability from their back end, especially with Wallman having missed these last couple of games. It is very easy to criticize guys like Ferraro and Ceci for this very reason, but I think you also have to put some blame onto the Sharks forwards, who are simply just not doing a very good job of actually supporting their teammates. The Flames were reading the Sharks like a book, were cutting off the wall, so were getting body position, which allowed them to maintain consistent offensive zone possession throughout the first 40 minutes of this game. It starts off in the first period. The Sharks actually look pretty good, just as they did at the beginning of the first period the other night against Vegas. This is likely due to the fact that the Flames have not played a game since coming back from the holiday break, and the Sharks, they were at the very least in action yesterday, but it did not take very long for Calgary to wake up here tonight, because for the last 15 minutes of this first period, the Sharks did not generate a single shot except for one Timothy Liljegren floater from pretty much the neutral zone. That was the easiest save of the NHL season for the Flames goaltender. Otherwise, it was all Calgary all the time in that last 15 minutes. And the Sharks should be thanking their lucky stars and also their goaltender that they were only down by 1 after that first 20 minutes. The second period was a slight improvement for the Sharks, but I would still go that so far as to say that the Flames had a significant edge in that middle frame. The Sharks would tie this one from a Celebrini power play goal that makes it 1-1 and avoids a shutout, but the Flames take the lead back with a goal from Backlund on a power play of their own, and it is a 2-1 game heading into the third. Now the Sharks at the very least avoid the usual pitfall that they have had recently, which is blowing third period leads. This time they're having to come back, but they failed to do even that. They only needed the single goal. But outside of the 6-on-5 where they did manage to get some good looks, there was not nearly enough pressure in the offensive zone to really make the life of the Flames goaltender all that challenging. They had some good looks, but not as many as you would hope for, and as such, they end up losing this game. Huberdeau does add an empty netter with about a second to go, but this doesn't really put away the game. It was pretty much already done by the time that this one was scored, and is a 3-1 loss for the Sharks. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Granlund and Toffoli being joined by Klim Kostin, who makes his return to the lineup here, and he bumps off Barclay Goodrow. Thanks for that. Now, in this position, when Kostin was going to return to the lineup, I was kind of going back and forth over these last couple of weeks of who would step out, either Grundstrom or Ty Dellandrea. As we know, it is physically impossible for Warsofsky to healthy scratch Barclay Goodrow. And I had originally settled on it being Carl Grundstrom to be the one to step out, simply because I have enjoyed the energy that Ty Dellandrea has brought, but Warsofsky went in a completely different direction, and he ends up healthy scratching Nikolai Kovalenko. Now, I don't absolutely hate this move. I don't think it comes completely out of left field, because as I even mentioned in yesterday's review, Kovalenko has been a little bit quiet as of late. He makes a couple of good plays here or there, which is certainly more than you can say about a few other Sharks players, but in terms of actually making a big impact, it hasn't really quite happened as of late. And so I could see the point of view from Warsofsky, but the reasoning I felt as though was a little bit worrying. You see, if you asked anybody who watched yesterday's game against Vegas who was the Sharks' best line, they would answer Celebrini, Smith, and Zetterlund, and it shouldn't even be particularly close. They were far and away the Sharks' most productive line in terms of the eye test, and if you take a look statistically as well, they heavily outchanced and outscored their opponents when they were on the ice, and they faced off against some tough matchups. They were on the ice somewhat frequently against guys like Mark Stone and Jack Eichel, and yet they still managed to be really, really effective. And when Warsofsky was asked at the end of that game what he believed and what he thought of Smith and Celebrini as a duo, he mentioned that they were good, they did some good things offensively, but then he transitioned into talking about building winning habits, which to me is an indirect way of saying that while they were good offensively, there were still a lot to work on, which I don't have a huge problem with as long as Warsofsky's opinion is still the prevailing one that they were the best line of that game against Vegas. But here today, we found out that he didn't actually believe that. He believed that the Sharks' fourth line of Grundstrom, Sturm, and Dellandrea was the Sharks' best, and even more than that, he said that they were the Sharks' best by far, which is some pretty strong language to use for these three players, because again, looking at it statistically, it does not support that point of view at all. Grundstrom, Dellandrea, and Sturm could not string a pass together in that particular game, and I made sure to mention that in my review, and so they really didn't get a ton of chances for themselves, and instead relinquished many of them when they were on the ice. Statistically, they were one of the worst lines for the Sharks. Now, from an eye test perspective, I actually thought they looked a little bit better than that, and I liked the energy, but still not even remotely close to what Celebrini and Smith and Zetterlund were able to do on a consistent basis in that game. So the fact that Warsofsky is valuing that type of performance is definitely a little bit worrying moving forward, and it's perhaps a insight into why Goodrow has never been a healthy scratch this season, and while he constantly ends up higher up in the lineup. Now, when it comes to this first line individually, to get back on track here, starting off with Klim Kostin, I thought this was a pretty good return to the lineup for him. He did have a few plays where he was making some Kostin level mistakes, especially in the second period. He had some pretty bad giveaways and he couldn't find a ton of openings, but in the first period when the Sharks as a whole were looking very, very bad, he actually was doing some okay things, and then especially in the third period, he was actually one of the Sharks' more effective players in that final 20 minutes, so I would say it was a good return for the lineup for him. I would say going into the Sharks' next game, I would not be remotely surprised if he manages to maintain this lineup spot. When it comes to his other winger on the other side, we have Tyler Toffoli. It was a relatively quiet game for Toffoli over the first 40 minutes. He definitely wasn't one of the Sharks' more effective players in those first couple of periods, but when that third period opened up a little bit more for the Sharks, he did manage to make a level of impact on the game, which was at the very least somewhat appreciated. So not a terrible game for Toffoli, probably middle of the pack type of performance amongst Sharks players, maybe slightly higher than that even. And then we come to Mikael Granlund. Now, at the end of the day here, was Granlund bad here tonight? Not quite, but the thing is that we are still missing the Mikael Granlund of old. Back in the first quarter of this year, he was the type of guy who could take over games and be a major driving force for the San Jose Sharks offense. Not only just a major, the major driving force for this offense. It felt as though everything would flow through him, and when the Sharks would get a point on the board, it was either because Granlund himself was scoring or at the very least picking up an assist. These days, however, Granlund is not having that same level of impact. He can still manage to be like the fourth or fifth best player on the ice for San Jose, but that's not quite where the Sharks are hoping to have him. And especially as we get closer and closer to the trade deadline, we know that Mikael Granlund was supposed to be one of the more attractive assets for the Sharks. Of course, many people are perhaps hoping that the Sharks would hold on to Mikael Granlund at this point, but I've always been of the opinion that if you get the right deal, you should jump at it, just as the Sharks did with Mackenzie Blackwood just a couple of weeks ago. But as each of these games passes and Granlund is making less and less of an impact, it becomes more and more difficult to actually be able to move on from him, considering he is on a relatively hefty contract and and the Sharks do not have a retention slot in. And I think especially if Granlund is not planning to re-sign at the end of this season, which was the plan for Mackenzie Blackwood, so it just goes to show that we don't really know what is going on behind the scenes here. If Granlund is not planning to re-sign with the Sharks, it would be in their best interest to be able to trade him away at the deadline, and they want him to be able to maintain that value, which he currently has just not really been doing. He's been scoring a lot less, been putting up a lot less points as of late, so while he's still managing to maintain that decent level of play, you are expecting and hoping for more. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Smith, Celebrini, and Zetterlund maintained as a trio. Thankfully, Warsofsky was at least a fan enough of these three players to give them another look here tonight. And while I will say that they were not as consistent as the last game against Vegas just yesterday, I will say that if we were taking a look at the Sharks' first two periods in this game, the first 40 minutes, when the Sharks actually found themselves in the offensive zone, it was pretty much always these three players helping do that. These guys had some great shifts. They worked the puck along well. At even strength, obviously, they didn't actually manage to score a goal, but considering they were the only effective line in the first 40 minutes of this game, you can't really be all that upset about it. I would still go so far as to say that they were the Sharks' best line on the night. The chemistry between Celebrini and Smith is still night and day between compared to really any other players, especially in terms of Will Smith's perspective. He hasn't found any great chemistry with all that many guys except for Macklin Celebrini. And so it is a duo that I am hoping that Warsofsky can maintain moving forward. When it comes to the third player on this line, Fabian Zetterlund, I talked about yesterday how he still doesn't seem as though the perfect winger for this group, but I still think he is filling in admirably. I'm just hoping that Warsofsky would be willing to swap just that one player instead of completely breaking up this line if ever things end up going sideways, which inevitably in the NHL things always do. Now, when it comes to the performances here tonight from an individual standpoint, I thought Zetterlund was actually pretty good. There were definitely a couple of shifts where passes were made to him and he was unable to handle it and the play would die on his stick, which was a little bit unfortunate to see, but more often than not, he was able to carry and follow through on these opportunities, and so, like I said, they generated some great shifts in the offensive zone. When it comes on the other side, we do have Will Smith, who I will say took a small step back from yesterday, which is probably to be expected, because yesterday he was one of, if not the best player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. But I still would say he was one of the better players that they had. He was all around the ice. He was making some decent plays. He had a great chance in the first period that he sends wide. He had a great setup for Mikael Granlund right at the end of the game. He was actually doing a decent job in the 6-on-5 at the blue line. There were definitely a couple of puck bobbles that made you hold your breath that Smith was going to end up blowing it and losing this puck out of the zone, but he was able to recover well enough to keep the pressure on for San Jose. There were obviously some defensive zone issues that did exist here tonight. There were a couple of times in which he lost puck battles, but there were also a couple of the fact that he's even being willing to engage in these puck battles, and a couple of times he managed to emerge victorious in them, or at the very least throw off the Flames player enough to be able to get back possession for the Sharks. I would still say is nice to see. He looks a lot more engaged here. I mean, just watching him yesterday crash the net against Vegas, that was nice to see, and while there wasn't an identical type of moment here, it still goes to show that that improvement is there, and I thought Smith was quite solid. When it comes to Macklin Celebrini, obviously he manages to maintain his point per game pace with this one goal that the Sharks actually scored here tonight on a very nice one-timer. So now 27 points in 27 games. That actually ties him with Matvei Mishkov for the rookie league lead in terms of points. And of course, as we know, Celebrini has played multiple less games. And so to me, at the very least, he is definitely amongst the, or really the front runner for the Calder Trophy, though it should be mentioned that the Sharks did face off against Dustin Wolf here, who was in between the pipes for the Calgary Flames, who was also a potential dark horse for that Calder nomination, if not victory, depending on how the Flames do and if they manage to make the playoffs off of the back of his titanic performance, as he did here tonight, where he was quite good for Calgary. But back on track when it comes to Macklin Celebrini, he did have a couple of issues when it came to moving through the neutral zone, maybe not having as much success. The Flames did a decent job of reading off of him, but he is still the type of player who will reliably manage to put up many great shifts. He was a driving force as per usual for the Sharks, and he was probably one of their best players yet again. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wenberg and Cunnin being joined by Barclay Goodrow. As I mentioned, thankfully he is no longer in the Sharks' top six. I am honestly getting a little bit tired of having to constantly give off these rants about how Goodrow doesn't belong in the Sharks' top six, because it's nothing nothing new. There's no new information being stated here. Everybody except Ryan Warsofsky is well aware that he belongs nowhere near players like Granlund, Toffoli, Smith, or Celebrini at all. Even on this third line, a lesser role for himself. He was an absolute disaster, offensive black hole, zero type of possession. It felt as though every time he stepped on the ice, the play was in the defensive zone. Maybe like once or twice he got a look in the offensive zone where he made like a half decent pass, but past that, there really wasn't anything to look forward to with his level of performance. To me, I'm looking directly at the Barracuda for guys who can actually bring up not only a better offensive level of play, but also just be a hungrier type of player in the lineup compared to Barclay Goodrow, who has had this fall from grace of being constantly a heavy competitive playoff team with the Rangers and the Tampa Bay Lightning before that, to now being a last place team in the entire league with the San Jose Sharks. It just feels as though there would be a better player served in this position. But you know what? I'm giving up the fight. We're 39 games in. It doesn't seem as though that's going to happen anymore. When it comes to Wenberg and Luke Kunin, they really didn't get to make a huge impact on this game here tonight. Kunin didn't really get to do much of anything. Wenberg, he had that great pass to Macklin Celebrini, but besides that, there wasn't really a lot to like. So I thought this third line was probably the weakest in this game. And when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Sturm and Dellandrea with Carl Grundstrom. But Grundstrom did not get to remain in this game for very long. Just a few minutes into this first period, he takes a huge open ice hit, which causes him to head down into the dressing room, and he does not return for the rest of the game. Somewhat similar to what happened to William Eklund just a couple of days ago against the Vancouver Canucks. And this does beg a very interesting question, because Grundstrom takes this hit, and to me, at least on first glance, I haven't really watched a ton of replays of it, it looks like a clean hit. But the Sharks take exception to it. Sturm goes directly after him, and the Sharks end up getting called for a penalty for that, as you would expect in such a situation. And I want to kind of open up this question here of, do you think that the Sharks should be continuously responding in these types of situations after these clean hits are landed? Because, these days in the NHL, these hits are definitely rather rare. Compared to 10, 15 years ago, you would watch guys like Chris Pronger or Nicholas Kronwall constantly manage to put guys down onto the ice with like hip checks and things like that, because the game was a little bit slower, there was a lot more brute force, and so you kind of just moved past it at that point. But these days, when things are so much faster and so much more skilled, and you have guys like Macklin Celebrini who are able to dip, duck, and dodge out of every possible hit heading his way, when those very, very few big hits like this one and like the Tyler Myers one a couple of games ago do end up landing, it feels as though it is like this monumental occasion that the team has to be able to respond to. Now, I'm fine when the team gets onto guys when there's like a dirty play that is being made. Rewinded a few weeks ago back to that Utah Hockey Club game when Celebrini gets boarded by Kevin Stenlund. That's where you want to see the team step up and actually respond to that, to send a message of, you can't take these sort of cheap shots onto our guys. But in a situation where Grundstrom just kind of has his head down and just gets absolutely nailed at center ice, I don't know if the response type of game there is something that I enjoy, but perhaps maybe that is something that the Sharks team wants to see. I imagine that is the type of look that Warsofsky wants to see from the team, as that is the reason for why these players do go after it. But I open the question to you guys, if that is something that you'd like to see, if you'd rather they kind of maybe just take a name, take a number there, and respond in a different way by trying to punish by actually scoring some goals instead of just ending up in the box right after. Moving on to the defensemen here tonight, we have the Sharks' top pairing of Thrun and Ceci. As I mentioned, still no Jake Wallman here, so they have to rely on these two guys, and then they have normally been like somewhat solid. Last game Ceci was kind of bad last game, but Thrun wasn't half bad. Here tonight, definitely a lot worse. Ceci in particular, I thought was perhaps the Sharks' worst defenseman of the night. A lot of bad plays, a lot of lost battles yet again, very much following up on yesterday where he did very much the same thing against the Vegas Golden Knights. So I was not impressed at all with what Ceci was doing here. I thought Thrun was maybe ever so slightly better than Ceci and more aware and more on the ball, but realistically he was also quite bad here tonight. Not a great performance out of the Sharks' top defensive pairing. When it comes to their second one, we have Ferraro and Liljegren, and for the second straight night, Ferraro, while still bad, there's not really any redeeming Mario Ferraro's performance here tonight. It wasn't that great, but it felt as though he was yet again not at the center of a ton of chaos in his own zone. So I guess that's kind of a positive for him. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, he had a very up and down game. It felt as though at the start of this one, in particular in the first period, Liljegren really struggled yet again. And I'm thinking, okay, this guy's definitely going to be sitting out once Wallman does return. But he actually got a little bit better as this game wore on. And he was actually rather effective for them in the third period. So I guess that was kind of nice to see. Not like a great game or anything, but it was definitely better than yesterday where he was just absolutely awful. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, it is Ruda and Mukhamadullin yet again. Mukhamadullin, I continue to appreciate the confidence that he is showing, the willingness to skate with the puck, the want to actually play with it and not just be someone who immediately passes it away. However, I do think there were some issues here tonight. I already talked about earlier on about how the Sharks were failing to clear pucks out. Mukhamadullin was definitely part of that problem, not necessarily part of the solution. I mean, the solution didn't really exist here tonight for the Sharks, so it was definitely a step back from where he was at yesterday, but still, I guess, all right. And then when it comes to Jan Ruda, also a step back from where he was at yesterday. Generally, all of the Sharks defensemen, except I guess Liljegren, who couldn't possibly take a step back because he would then fall off the cliff. Everyone else was definitely a decent bit worse, and so not a great night at all for, I would say, for Ruda. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, we do have Yaroslav Askarov. The major reason for why the Sharks were actually involved in this game, even remotely so, because you would think that if you remove this empty netter that gets scored in the last second of the game, it's a 2-1 loss. It's pretty close, but it really shouldn't have been. This first period, as I mentioned, the Sharks need to be thanking their goaltender that the fact that they were only down by 1-0, because it could have easily been a 2 if not 3-0 game after 20 minutes. And then after the second period as well, where the Flames still piled on some chances, it probably could have been like a 5-1 game at that point. But Askarov, he does an exceptional job. And it's interesting because I mentioned earlier on Dustin Wolf there on the other side being that Calder candidate. We're likely going to see a lot of matchups between both of those two goaltenders over the next decade or so, since Wolf is looking like the future starter for the Flames, and we know Askarov is the future starter of the San Jose Sharks. Here tonight, I can't even necessarily say that Wolf won the goaltending battle, because while of course he ends up being the victor in this game, Askarov had to deal with a ton more chances against. I mean, Wolf, realistically, maybe he lets in one more goal if he was looking a little bit more off. Askarov, if he was just playing, if this was Georgiev, let's just say as an example in net, the Sharks are not even remotely close in this particular game. So Askarov did his absolute best to try to keep the Sharks alive. There are still some small issues with his game. The fact that he is so willing to play the puck behind his net is good, but at times it seems to even fool his own team, and I wonder if the Sharks defensemen honestly get a little bit nervous when Askarov moves behind the net, because you can almost not really know what he's going to do, and he's a little bit unpredictable. And I also say his rebound control, which is something I noticed back when he played his first game against the St. Louis Blues a few weeks ago, does need a little bit of work, as he sends this rebound directly to Michael Backlund on this eventual game winner for Calgary. So not the best, but he was still remarkably solid here tonight. And again, with Georgiev in net, this isn't even a conversation about how this game was close. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday for New Year's Eve, a matchup against the Philadelphia Flyers. And that'll be, of course, a matchup as well between another Calder candidate, Matvei Mishkov. And we shall see how the Sharks look then, if they can finally break out of this losing streak. Class dismissed.